All right, let's just dive right into this explainer, because today we are confronting a heavy, heavy burden that pretty much anyone trying to make something new feels today. It's that immense, crushing pressure to create absolutely original work from scratch. I mean, we're taught from day one to idolize the lone, brooding artist or the rogue inventor working in a garage. Whether you're an entrepreneur, a writer, an engineer, or a designer, there's this profound expectation that true brilliance means conjuring a groundbreaking idea out of literally thin air, completely disconnected from anything that came before it. But today, we are going to completely deconstruct that. We are going to completely shatter this 18th century myth of the solitary genius and show you how profound innovation actually happens.
To see how deeply ingrained this myth is in our culture, just take a second and ask yourself a classic trivia question. Who actually invented the television? You might confidently say, oh, Philo T. Farnsworth, right? We all love that narrative, the lone genius toiling away in obscurity until a sudden flash of insight strikes him like lightning. But the hard historical truth? The TV, like almost all major insanely complex breakthroughs, was invented simultaneously by multiple independent people. I mean, think about the absurd complexity of early television. Vacuum tubes, cathode rays, electron scanning, signal broadcasting. One human brain didn't just invent all that on a Tuesday. Farnsworth was just one of several inventors, including people like John Logie Baird, who were simultaneously taking pieces of technology that already existed and rearranging them. The cultural narrative desperately wants a solitary hero, but reality, it's deeply collaborative.
So why do we cling so tightly to this myth of the lone hero? Well, it really boils down to our modern obsession with the concept of ex nihilo, which literally means creation out of nothing. You see, up until the 18th century, if you were a great creator, your true gift was how gracefully you could recover and remix older, pre-existing material. You found what worked, and you made it better. But then, we did a complete 180-degree turn. We suddenly decided that building on the past wasn't just lazy, it was the exact opposite of genius. We started demanding creation ex nihilo, the expectation that an idea has to be a totally magical spark, absolutely divorced from any past influence.
This beautifully illustrates a massive paradigm shift in how humanity actually viewed the creative process. Literary critics often describe it using two very different metaphors. For centuries, we held the classical view, which was the metaphor of the mirror. Art was simply supposed to reflect nature. Creating it was a mechanical, deliberate, structured craft. But then came the 18th century romantic view, the lamp. Suddenly, the author wasn't reflecting the outside world anymore. They were the lamp, radiating a completely original, ethereal light directly from their own internal soul. You weren't studying the world to build something sturdy. You were just meant to be overflowing with your own innate, unbidden, passionate feelings. And when you map this out, it is wild how fast this lone genius concept was artificially and rapidly constructed. Back in 1759, the writer Edward Young published a manifesto pushing this new romantic ideal. By 1793, the philosopher Immanuel Kant formalized it with his personality theory, essentially arguing that an author's unique soul is inextricably linked to their work. And by the 19th century, this philosophical engine actually crashed into the real world and fundamentally reshaped European property laws. No way, right? Governments actually started abolishing strict copyright formalities because they placed their legal trust in the divine, magical act of creation itself. Let's think about Edward Young for a second, because he really flipped the cultural script in 1759. Just listen to his exact words. He completely throws out the classical idea of a creator as a master remixer or a mechanical builder. Instead, he frames authorship as this mystical, unbidden organic growth. It grows, it is not made. Suddenly, the idea was that a mere imitator builds a machine out of borrowed parts, but a true genius organically grows a beautiful flower from their own unique roots. Originality became the ultimate sacred prize, and borrowing? That became a sin.
But hold on. What happens when we actually look at the data behind innovation? Modern academic research completely shatters this romantic 18th century myth. Stanford law professor Mark A. Lemley analyzed hundreds of significant historical technologies, and guess what? The canonical story of the lone genius solving a problem that stumped everyone else just doesn't hold up to the data. His research proves that discoveries almost always happen simultaneously, or nearly simultaneously, by completely independent teams. Invention is not an isolated spark. It's a social phenomenon that happens when the foundational ideas are simply in the air and ready to be connected.
So if geniuses aren't just pulling ideas out of an absolute vacuum, how does progress actually happen? Well, Mark Twain gave us this absolutely perfect poetic metaphor for how innovation truly works. He called it a mental kaleidoscope. Think about it.
You aren't generating brand new glass pieces out of thin air. You take the existing knowledge, you give the perspective a twist, and suddenly those exact same colored glass pieces align into an entirely new, breathtaking pattern. It completely tears down the illusion of the solitary creator. You literally need the old pieces to make the new pattern.
And this brings us to a foundational concept that completely replaces the myth of ex nihilo. It's called combinatorial creativity. Sociologists and cognitive scientists totally agree that creativity is never an isolated spark. It is a deliberate, cumulative rearrangement of what is already there. It's the act of reaching into the massive, shared database of human knowledge, pulling out specific items, and combining them in a novel, entirely unexpected way. It is literally turning that mental kaleidoscope to see how old facts can solve new problems.
Okay, let's see how this plays out in the real world, particularly in cumulative technologies like smartphones, biotech, or aviation. It essentially breaks down into 3 distinct steps. First, previous generations establish a base technology. Second, an innovator comes along and executes a novel rearrangement. They twist the kaleidoscope, right? And third, that new combination doesn't just stand alone, it instantly becomes a new foundational node. Today's combinatorial act literally lays the physical scaffolding for tomorrow's inventor. You simply cannot build a modern smartphone without directly accessing and utilizing this vast, interconnected chain of prior inventions.
Now, to really prove that this combinatorial approach is actually the natural state of humanity, we just have to look back before the Romantic era. If we go to ancient Mesopotamia, the very first known author in world literature, a high priestess named Enheduanna, proudly viewed herself not as a solitary genius, but as a weaver of pre-existing threads. She took the heavy, resistant threads of ancient tradition and crossed them on her loom in unprecedented ways. And honestly, this is truly fascinating. This is exactly why the Latin word for text literally translates to woven. Ancient authorship was fundamentally understood to be a collective, mediated creation, an intertwining of ideas that already existed.
And you know what? We still see this collaborative reality hiding behind the singular names on our bookshelves today. Even in modern commercial publishing, the lone genius completely fails the basic logic test. Take James Patterson, who at one point was publishing 13 books a year. One human simply cannot produce 13 polished books a year unless they don't sleep, or, more realistically, they operate like a highly collaborative factory. And this isn't even a new thing. Alexander Dumas did the exact same thing in the 19th century. The philosopher Michel Foucault pointed out that the singular name on a book cover is really just an author function. It's basically an epistemic, classifying concept used to neatly group works together for the market, not an actual reflection of a solitary creator. If you want to truly see the incredible power of collaborative creation over the lone genius, just think about this number, 6 million. That is the number of paper slips mailed in by everyday volunteer readers back in 1928 to help build the Oxford English Dictionary. That was crowdsourcing decades before the word even existed. The definitive record of the English language wasn't penned by a solitary mastermind locked in a tower, it was painstakingly assembled through the wisdom of the crowd, piece by piece, slip by slip.
Fast forward to 2001, and that exact same democratic, crowdsourced spirit gave birth to Wikipedia. It is the ultimate digital commons. It completely bypasses that dusty 18th century model of the celebrated named hero and functions entirely on collective intelligence. It proves at a massive global scale that the most comprehensive repositories of human knowledge are generated when we finally drop the illusion of solitary ownership and embrace cumulative, shared contribution.
And this ancient ethos, it's now the exact heartbeat of our modern digital network. The internet age has completely collapsed the boundary between the reader and the writer. Just like the musician and cultural theorist DJ Spooky advises, download, remix, edit, sequence, splice into your memory bank. In transformative cultures today, like the massive world of fan fiction, creators thrive by freely mixing and rearranging established ideas. They have completely shed the historical burden of strict ex nihilo originality, returning us right back to that ancient tradition of the weaver.
So as we reach the end of this explainer, we really have to look at the reality of how human progress actually works. It's not a series of isolated lightning strikes. It is a continuous, messy, beautiful, cumulative conversation spanning centuries. So the next time you sit down to work and you feel that paralyzing pressure to conjure brilliance out of thin air, give yourself some grace. Drop the myth. Ask yourself instead, what existing threads are you ready to pick up, and how will you twist your own mental kaleidoscope today?